Imagine taking what should be the perfect family vacation photo only to vanish without a trace moments later. For 7 agonizing years, the Henderson family's disappearance at Niagara Falls haunted investigators and left loved ones desperate for answers that seemed impossible to find. But what if I told you that a single drone flight recently uncovered evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about this case? What was hidden in those woods for nearly a decade? Why did the original search teams miss this crucial discovery? And most disturbing of all, what really happened in those final moments before an entire family simply ceased to exist? Before we uncover what that drone footage revealed, I know you're here because unsolved cases like this leave us all searching for the truth that investigators couldn't find. Take a moment to let me know in the comments what drew you to this story. Your engagement helps ensure mysteries like the Henderson family's disappearance get the attention and respect they deserve. The Henderson family looked like any other tourist family that sunny July morning in 2017. Dad Michael, 42, worked as an accountant. Mom Sarah, 38, taught elementary school. Their kids, Emma, age 12, and Jake, age 9, were excited about their first trip to Niagara Falls. They had planned this vacation for months, saving every penny for what they called their dream getaway. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm temperatures, and thousands of other families enjoying the famous waterfalls. Michael posted on Facebook that morning, "Finally here." Kids are beyond excited. But what started as the perfect family adventure would become one of North America's most baffling disappearances. Little did they know, someone was watching them that day. At exactly 2:47 p.m., Sarah Henderson took what would become the most analyzed family photo in missing persons history. The image shows all 4 family members smiling broadly, with Niagara Falls thundering behind them. Michael has his arm around Sarah while Emma and Jake hold colorful drinks they bought from a nearby vendor. Everyone looks happy, relaxed, and completely unaware of what was about to happen. The photo was automatically uploaded to Sarah's cloud storage, creating a permanent timestamp of their last known moment together. Witnesses later told police they saw the family near the observation deck around 3 p.m. A security camera caught them walking toward the parking area at 3:15 p.m. After that, it's as if the earth simply swallowed them whole. But there was something strange about their car that day, something nobody noticed until it was too late. When the Henderson family didn't return to their hotel that evening, staff initially weren't concerned. Tourists often stayed out late exploring the area. But by midnight, when their beds remained untouched and their luggage sat exactly where they'd left it, alarm bells started ringing. The hotel manager called local police at 6 a.m. the next morning. What officers discovered next sent chills down their spines. The family's rental car was gone from the hotel parking lot, but it wasn't found in any of the tourist parking areas around Niagara Falls. Their cell phones had all gone dark at exactly 3:22 p.m., just 7 minutes after the last security camera footage. Credit cards showed no activity after their drink purchase at 2:30 p.m. Most disturbing of all, none of the family members had told anyone, not friends, not extended family, not even Sarah's worried mother, about any plans to leave the falls area. The first 48 hours would reveal clues that made no sense at all. Detective Maria Santos had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but the Henderson disappearance felt different from the start. 4 people don't just vanish into thin air, she told reporters, especially not a family with 2 young children. The initial search involved over 200 officers, search dogs, helicopters, and dive teams. They combed every inch of the Niagara Falls area, from the tourist spots to the most remote hiking trails. The Canadian authorities joined the search, thinking the family might have crossed the border. But after 72 hours of intensive searching, they had found absolutely nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of the rental car, and no witnesses who remembered seeing them after 3:15 p.m. The case was officially classified as a missing persons investigation, but privately, detectives feared the worst. Then came the first strange clue that would haunt investigators for years. 3 days into the search, police received a call that changed everything. An anonymous tip came in at 11:43 p.m. from someone claiming to have seen the Henderson family's rental car driving fast on a remote back road about 20 miles from Niagara Falls. The caller described the car perfectly: a silver Toyota Camry with the correct license plate number. But here's what made detectives' blood run cold. The caller said this happened at 4:30 p.m. on the day the family disappeared, over an hour after they'd gone missing. Even stranger, the road the caller described was a narrow, rarely used path that led deep into the Finger Lakes forest region. Why would a tourist family with 2 young children drive onto such a remote road? Police rushed to the area and found tire tracks that could have belonged to any car. But they also found something else, something that suggested the Hendersons weren't alone that day. The tire tracks led investigators into some of the most dense, unforgiving wilderness in upstate New York. These weren't hiking trails or camping areas. This was raw forest where even experienced outdoorsmen rarely ventured. Search teams with dogs followed the tracks for miles, but the trail went cold where the dirt road ended and thick vegetation began. Helicopters flew overhead for days, but the tree canopy was so thick that spotting anything from above was nearly impossible. Ground teams reported finding broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, but nothing definitive. The forest seemed to have swallowed every trace of the missing family. After 2 weeks of searching, authorities called off the active investigation in that area. The terrain was simply too vast and dangerous for search teams to continue. What they didn't know was that the answer lay just 300 yards from where they stopped looking. The Henderson disappearance quickly became national news. Cable news shows featured the story nightly, and the family's last photo was shared millions of times on social media. With media attention came hundreds of tips and supposed sightings. People reported seeing the family in gas stations across 3 states. Others claimed they'd spotted them at theme parks, shopping malls, and even boarding flights to Mexico. Each lead was investigated, but they all led nowhere. Some tips were clearly from people seeking attention, while others seemed genuine but proved to be cases of mistaken identity. The most promising lead came from a truck driver who swore he'd seen Michael Henderson at a rest stop in Pennsylvania, but security cameras showed it was someone else entirely. After 6 months, the FBI joined the investigation, but even their resources couldn't crack the case. Meanwhile, something was happening in that forest that nobody knew about. As the investigation continued, detectives dug deep into the Henderson family's life, looking for any clue that might explain their disappearance. What they found was a perfectly ordinary American family. Michael had no debts, no enemies, and no history of mental health issues. His co-workers described him as reliable and kind. Sarah was beloved by her students and fellow teachers. She had no secrets, no affairs, and no reason to run away with her children. Emma and Jake were typical kids, good students who loved soccer and video games. The family had no connection to drugs, crime, or anything dangerous. Their finances were stable, their marriage was solid, and they had strong relationships with extended family and friends. In fact, they were so normal that investigators began to suspect something truly sinister had happened to them. But there was one detail about Michael that wouldn't surface until much later, a detail that might have saved their lives. July 15, 2018, exactly 1 year after the Henderson family vanished, Detective Santos stood at the same spot where their last photo was taken, hoping for some new insight or inspiration. The case had gone cold despite thousands of hours of investigation and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on the search. The family's extended relatives held a memorial service, though they refused to give up hope that their loved ones might still be alive somewhere. Sarah's mother, Dorothy, made an emotional plea on television. "If someone has my daughter and grandchildren, please just let them come home. We won't ask questions. We just want them back." The plea was shared millions of times, but it brought no new information. Police kept the case file open, but with no new leads, there wasn't much more they could do. What nobody knew was that just 5 miles away, nature was slowly revealing their secret. By 2020, the Henderson case had joined the ranks of America's most famous unsolved mysteries. True crime podcasts featured their story, documentary filmmakers reached out to the family, and online detectives proposed countless theories. Some believed the family had been murdered by a random killer. Others thought they'd somehow gotten lost in the wilderness and died of exposure. A few conspiracy theorists even suggested the family had staged their own disappearance, though investigators found zero evidence to support this theory. Sarah Henderson's classroom remained empty for 2 years before the school finally had to hire a replacement teacher. Michael's accounting firm kept his office exactly as he'd left it for 18 months. The children's rooms at home became shrines that their grandmother couldn't bear to change. As time passed, even the most optimistic family members began to accept that they might never see the Hendersons again. But in 2024, technology would finally catch up to this 7-year-old mystery. Meet Jake Morrison, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer who specializes in aerial footage of remote natural areas. In March 2024, Jake was commissioned by the New York State Environmental Conservation Department to document forest recovery in areas affected by recent storms. He'd been flying drones professionally for 8 years and had captured footage in some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. Jake was methodical in his work, flying precise grid patterns to ensure complete coverage of each area he documented. On March 15, 2024, he was mapping a section of forest about 25 miles from Niagara Falls, an area that had been hit by severe winds the previous winter. The storm had knocked down hundreds of trees, creating new clearings where sunlight could finally reach the forest floor for the first time in decades. Jake had no idea he was about to solve one of the region's most famous missing persons cases. March 15th started like any other workday for Jake. He arrived at the forest access road before sunrise, wanting to take advantage of the calm morning air for optimal drone flight conditions. His assignment was to document how wildlife was returning to areas where fallen trees had created new openings in the forest canopy. Jake launched his drone at 7:30 a.m. and began his systematic grid pattern flight. The high-definition camera captured every detail of the forest floor below: fallen logs, new growth, animal paths, and the occasional piece of litter left by hikers. For 3 hours, Jake methodically flew his drone back and forth, covering square mile after square mile of dense forest. Most of what he saw was exactly what he expected: trees, undergrowth, rocks, and the natural debris of a forest ecosystem. But at 10:47 a.m., his camera picked up something that made him freeze in disbelief. Jake was reviewing his footage on his laptop when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just another fallen tree covered in moss and vegetation. But something about the shape made him pause the video and zoom in. The object was too geometric, too uniform to be natural. Jake enhanced the image and adjusted the contrast. What he saw made his hands shake. Partially hidden under 7 years of plant growth, covered in moss and surrounded by fallen branches, was unmistakably a car. A silver car that looked exactly like a sedan. Jake immediately called his supervisor, but his boss told him to contact the police directly. "This is way above my pay grade," his supervisor said. "If there's a car in those woods, there might be—" Jake didn't need him to finish the sentence. Jake had found what had been hidden in those woods for nearly a decade, but what he discovered next was even more shocking. Detective Santos, now a sergeant, got the call at 11:30 a.m. When Jake Morrison explained what his drone had captured, she felt her heart skip a beat. After 7 years, could this finally be the break they'd been waiting for? Santos immediately contacted the sheriff's department and requested a search and rescue team to access the remote location. The coordinates Jake provided were deep in the forest, more than 2 miles from the nearest road. It would take specialized equipment and experienced personnel to reach the site safely. By 2 p.m., a team of 6 officers and 2 search specialists were hiking through thick undergrowth toward the GPS coordinates. The forest was so dense that they had to cut their way through in some places. After 90 minutes of difficult hiking, they reached the area where Jake's drone had spotted the mysterious object. What they found there would answer some questions, but create many more disturbing ones. When the search team finally reached the coordinates, they found exactly what Jake's drone had captured. There, almost completely hidden by 7 years of natural growth, was a silver Toyota Camry. The license plate, barely visible through the moss and vegetation, matched the Henderson family's rental car exactly. Officer Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran, later said it was one of the most eerie sights he'd ever encountered. The car sat in a small natural clearing, surrounded by trees that had grown around it over the years. Vines had grown through the broken windows, and the entire vehicle was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. It looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie, a piece of civilization that nature had slowly reclaimed. The team immediately secured the scene and called for additional forensic specialists. But the real question wasn't how the car got there. It was what they would find inside. By evening, the remote forest clearing had been transformed into a carefully controlled crime scene. Portable lights illuminated the moss-covered vehicle, while forensic specialists began the delicate process of documenting everything before disturbing the scene. Dr. Patricia Wong, the lead forensic investigator, had worked on hundreds of cases, but she'd never seen a vehicle that had been claimed by nature quite like this one. The team used special brushes and tools to carefully remove vegetation from the car without destroying potential evidence. Every leaf, every piece of moss, every branch was photographed and cataloged before being removed. The process was painstakingly slow, but it was crucial to preserve any clues about what had happened to the Henderson family. As daylight faded, powerful LED lights were set up around the perimeter. When they finally opened the driver's side door, what they found inside would change the entire direction of the investigation. The interior of the car told a story that made the forensic team's blood run cold. The Hendersons' personal belongings were still there: Sarah's purse on the passenger seat, the children's backpacks in the rear, Michael's wallet in the center console. But there were no bodies inside the vehicle. Even more disturbing, there were clear signs of a struggle. The driver's seat was pushed back much further than it would have been for Michael's height. The steering wheel had scratches on it as if someone had gripped it desperately. Most chilling of all, there were what appeared to be restraint marks on the seats, impressions in the fabric that suggested ropes or zip ties had been used. Dr. Wong carefully collected fabric samples and photographed every detail. The car's windows had been smashed from the outside, allowing the forest to gradually invade the interior over 7 years. But the most disturbing evidence was found in the trunk. When forensic specialists finally opened the trunk of the Toyota Camry, they discovered evidence that transformed the Henderson disappearance from a missing persons case into something much darker. Inside the trunk, preserved by the car's relatively dry interior, they found duct tape, zip ties, and a crowbar that clearly didn't belong to the Henderson family. These weren't items that a family would pack for a vacation to Niagara Falls. Even more disturbing, they found children's clothing that had been cut off with a sharp instrument, Emma's favorite T-shirt, and Jake's soccer shorts, both bearing what appeared to be dried bloodstains. Dr. Wong immediately called for additional forensic specialists and a crime scene photographer. The evidence suggested that the Henderson family had been the victims of a violent crime, not an accident or a case of getting lost in the wilderness. But if the family wasn't in the car, where were they? And were they still alive? With evidence of foul play now confirmed, law enforcement launched the largest search operation in the region's history. Over 300 officers, FBI agents, and search specialists combed every inch of forest within a 5-mile radius of the abandoned car. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for human remains. Ground-penetrating radar was used to check for burial sites. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept the area from above. The search continued for 6 weeks, but despite the massive effort, no trace of the Henderson family members was found. The forest had kept its secret for 7 years, and it wasn't giving up any more clues easily. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the evidence found in the car was beginning to paint a picture of what might have happened on that July day in 2017. The DNA results would reveal something that nobody saw coming. The forensic lab worked around the clock to analyze the evidence found in the Henderson family's car. Blood samples from the children's clothing confirmed what everyone feared. It belonged to Emma and Jake Henderson. But there was also DNA from at least 2 other people, neither of whom were in the national database. This meant the perpetrators had no previous criminal record, making them much harder to identify and track down. The zip ties and duct tape showed fingerprints, but again, no matches in the system. However, forensic experts were able to determine that the tools found in the trunk were purchased from a specific hardware store chain. FBI agents began the painstaking process of checking security camera footage from every store in the region, looking for someone who had purchased those exact items in the days before the Henderson family's disappearance. What they discovered would lead them to a suspect nobody expected. After reviewing hundreds of hours of security footage from hardware stores within a 100-mile radius of Niagara Falls, FBI agents made a breakthrough. On July 13, 2017, just 2 days before the Henderson family disappeared, a man had purchased zip ties, duct tape, and a crowbar from a hardware store in Buffalo, New York. The purchase was made with cash, but the store's high-definition security cameras captured clear images of the buyer. He appeared to be in his 30s, average height and build, with dark hair and no distinguishing features. He seemed nervous, checking over his shoulder several times while making the purchase. The store clerk who served him remembered the transaction because the man had been sweating heavily, despite the store's air conditioning. FBI agents distributed the suspect's image to law enforcement agencies across the region and launched a public appeal for information. Within 24 hours, they received a tip that would break the case wide open. The call came in to the FBI tip line at 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. A woman, speaking in hushed tones, claimed she recognized the man from the hardware store security footage. She said his name was David Coleman, and that he had been obsessed with true crime cases and missing person stories for years. According to the caller, Coleman had specifically mentioned the Henderson family case multiple times, showing what she described as unhealthy interest in the details. The woman claimed to be Coleman's ex-girlfriend and said she'd broken up with him because of his disturbing behavior and violent fantasies. She provided an address in a rural area about 40 miles from where the car was found. FBI agents immediately began surveillance of the property while they obtained search warrants. What they observed over the next 48 hours convinced them they had found their suspect. But Coleman wasn't alone, and what they discovered at his property would reveal the full scope of this nightmare. For 48 hours, FBI agents watched David Coleman's remote property through high-powered binoculars and listening devices. What they observed was deeply disturbing. Coleman lived alone in a rundown farmhouse surrounded by dense woods. the perfect place to hide criminal activity. The agents noticed that Coleman kept unusual hours, often staying awake all night and sleeping during the day. He rarely left his property, and when he did, he drove a different vehicle each time, suggesting he had access to multiple cars. Most chilling of all, agents observed Coleman digging in his backyard on multiple occasions, always at night and always alone. The property had several outbuildings that could easily conceal evidence or even victims. Agent Maria Rodriguez, who was leading the surveillance team, later said that Coleman's behavior suggested he was either hiding something terrible or preparing for something worse. On the third night of surveillance, they saw something that forced them to act immediately. At 11:47 p.m. on the third night of surveillance, agents observed Coleman loading what appeared to be heavy plastic bags into the back of a pickup truck. The bags were clearly weighted down with something substantial, and Coleman was struggling to lift them. Agent Rodriguez made the decision to move in immediately, fearing that Coleman might be destroying evidence or worse, disposing of bodies. Within minutes, tactical teams surrounded the property while helicopters provided overhead support. Coleman was arrested without incident as he attempted to drive away from his property. He showed no surprise at being caught, which agents found particularly disturbing. In fact, Coleman seemed almost relieved, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 7 years. The plastic bags in his truck contained tools and equipment, not bodies, but what agents found when they searched his property would reveal the true horror of what had happened to the Henderson family. Coleman's first words to investigators would chill them to the bone. When David Coleman was brought in for questioning, his first words to Detective Santos were, "I've been waiting for you to find me." He waived his right to an attorney and immediately began talking about the Henderson family. Coleman's confession was detailed, methodical, and absolutely horrifying. He had been following families visiting Niagara Falls for months, studying their patterns and looking for the perfect victims. The Hendersons caught his attention because they seemed like a happy, normal family, exactly what he was looking for. Coleman had followed them from their hotel to the falls, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. He described in chilling detail how he had approached them in the parking area, pretending to be a lost tourist asking for directions. What Coleman revealed next about those final moments would answer the third question that had haunted investigators for 7 years. But the truth was worse than anyone imagined. According to Coleman's confession, he approached the Henderson family at 3:20 p.m., just as they were returning to their rental car. He pretended to be a confused tourist who needed directions to a nearby attraction. Michael Henderson, being the kind person he was, stopped to help. This was exactly what Coleman had been counting on. While Michael was distracted looking at Coleman's fake map, Coleman struck him in the head with a weapon he'd hidden in his jacket. Sarah screamed, which caused other tourists to look in their direction, so Coleman quickly forced the family into their own car at gunpoint. The children were terrified, but followed their parents' whispered instructions to stay quiet and cooperate. Coleman drove them away from the tourist area toward the remote forest road where the anonymous caller had spotted them. What really happened in those final moments was even more tragic than investigators had feared. Coleman forced Michael to drive while he held a gun on the family. Sarah tried to comfort the children, whispering that everything would be okay, but Coleman ordered her to stay quiet. According to his confession, Coleman directed them deeper and deeper into the forest, along increasingly remote roads. He claimed he originally planned to rob them and let them go, but said the children had seen his face too clearly. When they reached the isolated clearing where the car would eventually be found, Coleman ordered everyone out of the vehicle. Michael begged Coleman to let his family go, offering him all their money and valuables. Sarah pleaded with Coleman, telling him that the children were innocent and didn't deserve to be hurt. But Coleman had already made his decision. He had brought rope and restraints with him, indicating this had been planned all along. What happened next would reveal why the search teams never found the family's bodies. Coleman's confession revealed that he had forced the family deeper into the woods, away from their car, to a location he had scouted weeks earlier. It was a natural depression in the forest floor, hidden by thick vegetation and nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. Coleman claimed that Michael had tried to fight back to protect his family, but Coleman was prepared with weapons and restraints. The children watched in terror as their father was overpowered. Coleman said that Sarah had begged him to spare the children's lives, offering to do anything he wanted if he would just let Emma and Jake go. But Coleman had crossed a line from which there was no return. He admitted to killing the entire family in that hidden location, then burying their bodies in a grave he had dug beforehand. But Coleman's story was about to take an even more disturbing turn. After murdering the Henderson family, Coleman spent hours covering up his crime. He dragged their rental car deeper into the woods and used branches and debris to camouflage it. Over the following weeks and months, Coleman returned to the site multiple times to ensure the car remained hidden as vegetation grew over it. He also moved the family's bodies to different locations, making it nearly impossible for search teams to find them even if they searched the right area. Coleman admitted that he had followed the news coverage of the search efforts and had even joined some of the volunteer search parties to keep track of how close investigators were getting to his crime scene. This revelation shocked investigators. Coleman had literally helped search for the family he had murdered. But there was still one crucial question that Coleman's confession hadn't answered, the question that had puzzled investigators from the very beginning. Detective Santos asked Coleman the question that had haunted the investigation for 7 years. Why had the original search teams missed the car when they were so close to finding it? Coleman's answer revealed the chilling extent of his preparation and knowledge. He had researched search and rescue techniques extensively and had specifically chosen the hiding spot because he knew how search patterns worked. The location where he hid the car was in a natural blind spot, an area that would appear to have been searched from multiple angles, but where a small clearing could remain hidden from view. Coleman had also used his knowledge of cadaver dogs to his advantage, moving the bodies to locations downwind from where he expected searchers to focus their efforts. The original search teams had missed this crucial discovery because Coleman had outsmarted them at every turn, but his luck was finally about to run out. Armed with Coleman's detailed confession and precise locations, law enforcement launched a recovery operation to find the Henderson family's remains. The area Coleman described was even more remote and difficult to access than where the car had been found. It took specialized equipment and expert climbers to reach the location safely. After 3 days of careful excavation, investigators found exactly what Coleman had described, the final resting place of Michael, Sarah, Emma, and Jake Henderson. The discovery brought closure to 7 years of uncertainty, but also confirmed the worst fears of everyone who had hoped the family might somehow still be alive. The recovery operation was conducted with the utmost respect and dignity. Each family member was carefully removed from their resting place and transported to the coroner's office for official identification. But even with the bodies recovered and the killer in custody, the case still held one final, shocking surprise. When forensic experts analyzed DNA samples from the crime scene and compared them to Coleman's DNA, they made a discovery that nobody expected. The unknown DNA found in the car didn't match Coleman at all. This meant there had been at least one other person involved in the Henderson family's murder, an accomplice who was still free. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Coleman had confessed to the murders, but had never mentioned having a partner. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Coleman initially denied having any help. But under intense questioning, he finally admitted the truth. He had not acted alone. There was a second person involved, someone who had helped him plan the attack and dispose of the evidence. Coleman's reluctance to name his accomplice suggested this person might be someone close to him, someone he felt loyalty toward, despite their involvement in multiple murders. The identity of Coleman's accomplice would shock the entire community. Under pressure from FBI agents and faced with undeniable DNA evidence, Coleman finally revealed the identity of his accomplice, his own brother, Thomas Coleman. Thomas had helped plan the attack on the Henderson family and had been present during the murders. According to David Coleman's expanded confession, Thomas had been the one driving the pickup truck that followed their rental car to the forest, ensuring they weren't being followed and providing backup if anything went wrong. Thomas had also helped dig the graves and move the bodies to their final hiding places. The brothers had kept this terrible secret for 7 years, trusting each other completely to never reveal what they had done. But Thomas Coleman had no idea that his brother had been arrested and was cooperating with authorities. FBI agents immediately began searching for Thomas, who worked as a mechanic in a town about 60 miles away. What they found at Thomas Coleman's home would reveal just how deep this conspiracy went. FBI agents arrested Thomas Coleman at his workplace without incident. Unlike his brother, Thomas attempted to deny any involvement in the Henderson murders, claiming he had no idea what David was talking about. But when confronted with his brother's detailed confession and the DNA evidence, Thomas realized his lies wouldn't work. His arrest shocked his co-workers and neighbors, who described him as quiet and reliable. Nobody suspected that he was harboring such a dark secret. During his interrogation, Thomas provided additional details about the murders that corroborated his brother's confession. He also revealed that the Coleman brothers had discussed targeting other families, but had been too afraid to act again after the massive law enforcement response to the Henderson disappearance. Thomas led investigators to additional evidence that had been hidden at various locations around the region, but the most disturbing revelation was yet to come, evidence that suggested the Henderson family might not have been their first victims. When FBI agents searched Thomas Coleman's home and workshop, they found a collection of newspaper clippings, photographs, and personal items that suggested the Coleman brothers had been involved in other unsolved disappearances. Hidden in Thomas's garage were souvenirs from at least 3 other families who had gone missing in the region over the past decade. There were driver's licenses, jewelry, and clothing items that belonged to people who had vanished without a trace years earlier. Each item was carefully preserved and cataloged, suggesting the brothers had kept trophies from their victims. This discovery transformed the Henderson case from a single family murder into a serial killing investigation spanning multiple years and potentially multiple states. Law enforcement agencies across the Northeast began reviewing their cold cases, looking for any connections to the Coleman brothers. The full scope of their crimes was only beginning to come to light. As investigators analyzed the evidence found at Thomas Coleman's property, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The Coleman brothers had been targeting families on vacation for over a decade. They specifically chose families with children, believing that parents would be more likely to cooperate to protect their kids. The brothers would follow families from tourist attractions to isolated areas, then attack when the victims were most vulnerable. Most of their previous victims had been traveling from out of state, which explained why local authorities hadn't connected the disappearances. The families had simply vanished during their vacations, and the investigations had been handled by different law enforcement agencies that didn't communicate with each other. The Henderson family had been the brothers' largest target, 4 victims instead of their usual 2 or 3. This might have been what eventually led to their downfall, as the massive search effort had kept the case in the public eye for 7 years. But there was one more piece of evidence that would reveal the true extent of their evil. Hidden in a storage unit rented under a false name, investigators found what they called a kill kit, a collection of tools and supplies that the Coleman brothers had assembled specifically for murdering their victims. The kit contained weapons, restraints, digging tools, body bags, and chemicals for destroying evidence. Most disturbing of all, it contained detailed maps of remote areas throughout the Northeast where bodies could be hidden permanently. The brothers had spent years scouting locations and planning their crimes with methodical precision. They had even practiced their attack techniques and timing to minimize the chances of being caught. The storage unit also contained written notes describing their victims and their murders, suggesting the brothers had been documenting their crimes like a twisted hobby. Reading these notes, investigators realized that the Coleman brothers had killed at least 12 people over 10 years. The final entry in their journal would reveal their plans for an even more horrific crime. The last entry in the Coleman brothers' journal, dated just 1 week before David's arrest, described their plans for what they called their grand finale. They had been planning to target a family reunion at a popular camping area, intending to kill an entire extended family of 15 people. The journal entry included detailed surveillance notes about the family, their camping schedule, and the remote location where the reunion was planned to take place. The brothers had spent months preparing for this attack, which would have been their largest mass murder yet. They had even rented a cabin near the camping area and had begun stockpiling supplies for the attack. If David Coleman hadn't been caught when he was, 15 more innocent people would have died. The camping trip was scheduled for the weekend after his arrest. This revelation would change how authorities viewed the entire investigation. Using the evidence found in the Coleman brothers' storage unit, law enforcement was able to identify most of their previous victims. The Brennan family from Ohio, parents and twin daughters who disappeared while visiting state parks in 2015. The Martinez couple from Florida, who vanished during their honeymoon in the Adirondacks in 2016. The elderly Wilson couple from Pennsylvania, who never returned from their anniversary trip in 2018. Each case had been investigated separately, with no connection made between them until now. The families of these victims had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones, just like the Henderson family had. Now, finally, they would have answers and closure. But the knowledge that their family members had been murdered by serial killers brought its own kind of pain. Dorothy Henderson, Sarah's mother, spoke for all the families when she said, "We needed to know the truth, even though the truth is more horrible than we ever imagined." The legal proceedings would bring even more shocking revelations. As prosecutors prepared their case against the Coleman brothers, they faced an unprecedented challenge. They were dealing with multiple murders across several states, spanning over a decade. The evidence was overwhelming, but organizing it into a coherent case that could be presented to a jury was a massive undertaking. The brothers would be tried separately, with David Coleman facing charges first, since he had confessed and was cooperating with authorities. Thomas Coleman continued to claim he was just following his brother's lead and hadn't intended for anyone to die. But the evidence clearly showed both brothers were equally responsible for planning and carrying out the murders. The prosecution team included experts in serial killer psychology, forensic evidence, and victim impact testimony. They knew this would be one of the most important cases in the region's history, and they were determined to get justice for all the victims and their families. The trial would reveal details about the murders that even the investigators hadn't known. David Coleman's trial began on a cold January morning in 2025. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, reporters, and curious onlookers who had followed the case for years. Coleman showed no emotion as the charges were read: 12 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented DNA evidence, the victim's personal belongings found in Coleman's possession, and his own detailed confession. But it was the testimony of the families that brought the courtroom to tears. Dorothy Henderson spoke about her daughter Sarah's love for teaching and her grandchildren's bright futures that were cut short. Other family members described the years of uncertainty and pain they had endured, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Coleman listened to it all without showing any remorse or emotion. When Coleman finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony would shock everyone in the courtroom. When David Coleman took the stand, he showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he spoke about his victims as if they were objects rather than human beings. He described in chilling detail how he had chosen each family, explaining his selection criteria like a hunter discussing his prey. Coleman claimed he felt no guilt about the murders, saying that his victims were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His testimony was so disturbing that several jury members were visibly shaken. Coleman's court-appointed attorney tried to argue that his client was mentally ill, but Coleman himself rejected this defense. "I knew exactly what I was doing," he said. "I just didn't care about the consequences." The prosecution used Coleman's own words against him, showing that he was not insane, but simply evil. His complete lack of remorse convinced the jury that he deserved the harshest possible punishment. The jury's verdict would be delivered faster than anyone expected. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. David Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 200 years. The judge called Coleman's crimes among the most heinous in this state's history and said that he represented the very worst of humanity. When the verdict was read, Dorothy Henderson broke down in tears, finally feeling that her daughter and grandchildren had received justice. Other family members hugged each other, and the prosecutors who had worked so hard to convict Coleman. Coleman himself showed no reaction to the verdict, staring straight ahead as if the proceedings didn't concern him. Outside the courthouse, Detective Santos, now retired, spoke to reporters. "This case haunted me for 7 years. I'm grateful that we finally got answers for these families, even though those answers came at such a terrible cost." But Thomas Coleman's trial would bring even more surprises. Thomas Coleman's trial began 6 months later, and his defense strategy was completely different from his brother's. Thomas claimed he had been manipulated and controlled by David for his entire life, and that he had participated in the murders only because he was afraid of his older brother. His attorneys presented evidence of childhood abuse and psychological manipulation that had made Thomas dependent on David's approval. They argued that Thomas was a victim himself, caught up in his brother's twisted fantasies. The prosecution countered that Thomas was an adult who had made his own choices, and that the evidence showed he had been an enthusiastic participant in planning and carrying out the murders. The journal entries found in their storage unit showed that Thomas had suggested several of the victims and had helped plan their attacks. He had also been the one to suggest keeping trophies from their victims. The jury would have to decide between two very different versions of Thomas Coleman. Thomas Coleman's jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching their verdict. They found him guilty of all charges, but recommended a sentence of life in prison rather than life without parole, citing the evidence of his brother's manipulation. The judge agreed with the jury's recommendation, sentencing Thomas to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The different sentences reflected the jury's belief that while both brothers were guilty, David had been the primary architect of their crimes. With both Coleman brothers behind bars, the families of their victims finally had the closure they had sought for so many years. The Henderson family's ordeal, which began with a simple vacation photo at Niagara Falls, had finally come to an end. The final moments before the Henderson family ceased to exist were exactly as horrific as their loved ones had feared, but now, at least, they knew the truth. In the months following the trials, the families of the Coleman brothers' victims began the long process of healing. Support groups were formed for family members who had lost loved ones to serial killers. Dorothy Henderson became an advocate for improved communication between law enforcement agencies, arguing that if police departments had shared information more effectively, the Coleman brothers might have been caught years earlier. The case also led to changes in how missing persons cases are investigated, with more emphasis on looking for patterns across multiple jurisdictions. The remote forest area where the Henderson family's car was found became an unofficial memorial site, with people leaving flowers and messages of remembrance. The New York State Police established a new cold case unit specifically to review unsolved disappearances and look for connections that might have been missed. But there was one more discovery that would provide a small measure of comfort to the victims' families. Among the personal belongings recovered from the Coleman brothers' storage unit, investigators found something unexpected: letters that some of the victims had written but never had the chance to send. Sarah Henderson had written a letter to her mother during the family's car ride to Niagara Falls, describing how excited the children were about their vacation. She had planned to mail it as a surprise when they returned home. The letter was found in her purse, still sealed in its envelope. Other victims had also left behind final messages, vacation postcards, journal entries, and voicemails that painted a picture of happy families enjoying their last moments together. These discoveries provided their loved ones with a final connection to the people they had lost. Dorothy Henderson treasured her daughter's last letter, which ended with the words, "The kids are having the time of their lives. This is exactly the kind of family memory I always hoped we'd create together." These final messages would inspire one last act of remembrance. 2 years after the trials ended, the families of all the Coleman brothers' victims came together to create a permanent memorial. The memorial was established at a peaceful park overlooking Niagara Falls, not far from where the Henderson family had taken their last photograph. The memorial features a bronze plaque with the names of all 12 victims, surrounded by a garden with flowers that bloom throughout the year. Each family contributed something personal to the memorial: photos, favorite quotes, or small mementos that represented their loved ones' lives. The memorial serves as a place where family members can come to remember their loved ones and find peace. It also serves as a reminder that behind every missing persons case are real people with families who love them and will never stop searching for answers. The inscription on the memorial reads, "In memory of those who were taken too soon, and in honor of those who never stopped looking for them." The memorial would become a symbol of hope for other families dealing with similar tragedies. The Henderson family case changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons investigations. The key lesson was the importance of interagency communication and the need to look for patterns across different jurisdictions. If police departments had been sharing information more effectively, investigators might have noticed that families were disappearing from tourist areas throughout the Northeast. The case also highlighted the importance of new technology in solving cold cases. Without Jake Morrison's drone footage, the Henderson family's car might never have been found, and the Coleman brothers might have continued killing for years. The investigation showed that even the most carefully planned crimes can be solved with persistence, technology, and a little bit of luck. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that families should never give up hope for answers, even when years pass without any new leads. Sometimes the breakthrough comes when you least expect it. The story of the Henderson family would continue to impact lives long after the trials ended. Today, the Henderson family case is studied in law enforcement academies as an example of how persistence and modern technology can solve even the most challenging cold cases. Jake Morrison, the drone operator who made the crucial discovery, has started a non-profit organization that uses drone technology to help search for missing persons. He has already helped solve 3 other cold cases, bringing closure to families who had been waiting for answers for years. Dorothy Henderson has written a book about her family's ordeal, with proceeds going to support missing persons investigations. The book has become a bestseller and has helped raise awareness about the thousands of families who are still searching for missing loved ones. The Henderson family's story is a reminder that behind every statistics about missing persons are real people with real families who deserve answers. Their legacy is not just the justice that was finally served, but the hope they have given to other families that the truth can eventually be found, no matter how long it takes. The Henderson family's tragic disappearance at Niagara Falls reminds us that behind every missing person case lies a family desperately searching for answers. This true crime mystery shows how disappeared without a trace cases can suddenly break open years later through new technology and persistent investigation. From vanished without a trace to shocking discovery, their story represents thousands of unsolved missing person cases where families never stop hoping. Whether it's missing children and adults cases, mysterious disappearances, or long-term missing persons cases, each disappearance mystery deserves the same dedication investigators showed here. If you're fascinated by real unsolved mysteries and suspenseful missing person stories, let us know in the comments which famous missing person cases you'd like us to cover next. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime disappearance documentaries and missing persons investigation updates that bring closure to families who never gave up hope.